For those of you who are on Facebook, which is precisely 0 of you, this is a live recording of our interview with Pete Smissen from the Aussie English Podcast, and on the left-hand side or the right-hand side is Jake Farwharton, and on the other side of that is me, and we've got Pete. You're in the middle. You're in the middle of us three.
Oh,
meat in the sandwich.
You are the you are the meat in the sausage sandwich. We're gonna have a conversation. Most of this sort of banter won't make it onto the actual podcast, so this is a little bit of a behind the scenes
unless it's good
sneak peek. And depending on the interview, maybe most of it won't even make it onto the podcast, Pete. So no pressure.
No pressure. And I've got to watch my mouth, right? No swearing.
Yeah, no swearing.
Yes.
No swearing.
Yes,
we are
everything's G-rated.
Both watch and filter your mouth.
Yeah. And I'll keep you updated with how many viewers we've got on Facebook, because that's my favorite part of it. And also they're able to comment and we can see those and things like that anyway. So we're going to make a start.
Send me the link.
Now the link will be, Pete, on our Facebook page. If I could show you how many windows I had open on my computer right now, I have a heart attack.
I'm afraid of getting lost in the windows.
Jake and I run a podcast called The Pouch the Podcast. You can check us out on thepouchthepodcast.com, where you can choose your favorite podcast player of choice.
Podcast. Big sponsors of the show.
Big sponsors of the show. That's pretty much the only in-joke we have.
Yep.
All right. You ready to go, Pete?
I'm uncaged.
Ooh.
Can you cage yourself a little bit?
Wrong podcast.
Just at night, my wife makes me do it, so.
All right. Hello and welcome to The Pouch, the unmatched socks of podcasts, which aims to help the average Aussie try and make sense of their current political environment. I'm Greg. I have too many hue lights in my room. Savage.
And I'm Jake. I didn't prepare anything for this intro, Farwharton.
On today's episode, we have a very special guest with us. We have Pete Smissen from the Aussie English Podcast. Pete, we go way back before podcasts were even invented. How are you going?
I'm good, man. Those were the days. That was back when our podcast was about the size of Joe Rogan's, right?
It was. It was literally the size of Joe Rogan's podcast, and we did it in garages, literally in garage, using GarageBand. We put it to good use. How are you coping during these times before we get to the nitty gritty of it? How are you coping at the moment? Have you been stuck inside?
Wow, I've been working on my studio tan, so it's nothing's
Pete,
changed.
It's working.
I'm a full-time podcaster. It's my life now. So I pretty much didn't even know we had coronavirus until last week. So
yeah, well, that's. I think every second podcast is about coronavirus at the moment. So you've sort of missed the train there. We'll get to all of that. We'll get to your history of how you became a podcaster and a full-time podcaster, mind you, which is amazing. So check out Aussie English if you're bored during this interview.
Well, you need to work on your English.
Yeah. So Pete, I want to start by just talking about, basically, really how you got started in this. So the way that we knew each other was we got into podcasts before all of this sort of stuff. Then you sort of dipped down a little bit out of our lives, and then all of a sudden you pop back up, and you've got this podcast, Aussie English Podcast. Tell us about it and how it sort of got started.
Well, you guys were the reason, really. I think I was...
And that's the end of the interview. Thanks so much, Pete.
It was great talking to you, buddy. Yeah,
You're welcome. Well, this would have been back in 2010, right, where we were going to the Atheist Conference when that movement was sort of taking hold in Australia. Richard Dawkins, Hitchens, the Four Horsemen and everything were a big thing worldwide. And we were getting into, secular critical thinking and all of the science that was going around. And I know Jake had his podcast. I can't remember the year that it started, but I remember on Facebook, I think you asked, I need to get someone to come on to do a science clip. And I was doing my Masters of Science at the time and sent in, I think I sent in something talking about phases of the moon or something. I can't remember what the exact topic was, but
that's about right. Yeah.
Jake obviously had no one else apply and was like, you'll do.
It's actually not true. I did have several people apply. It's just none of them were as charismatic as you clearly were.
Yes. So thanks to that decision. It's one of those things, isn't it? It's funny that you have those moments, you look back at your life and you're like, there are these key moments that happen where you're like, okay, the branch bifurcated and I went one direction over another. So I ended up on Jake's podcast, obviously, Imaginary Friend Show. Met the handsome Greg over here as well, I think on the first show that I would have been on. And then, I guess did that for a few years, right, Jake, sporadically.
Yeah.
You were the resident person who knew what they were talking about.
And then I found someone else.
Yeah, exactly. And then I think I started a PhD and got too busy. So dropped off the radar. And then I guess the real reason that I got back into it was that I started finding it interesting to learn languages. I was really interested in learning a foreign language. I felt kind of ashamed being an Australian, living in Melbourne. I'd started training at a jiu-jitsu MMA gym, and most of the people there were foreigners. They were students from China, from Singapore, from France, Germany, and they all spoke English, but they all spoke multiple other languages. And so I started to feel a bit, like, oof, why don't I speak another language? I went down the sort of rabbit hole of learning French online. I'd done that at school. So I had a bit of a background, just had to sort of rekindle that. And after about 6 months, got fluent in French after, practicing a lot, going to meetups, practicing every day, reading books, listening to podcasts. And I was listening to a podcast called Français Authentique, and he did what I effectively do.
It's a classic
podcast.
That's
it. Authentic French, Français Authentique.
Okay.
So but he's huge, but I took his idea.
Big fat guy, very big, girthful
Presume
gentleman.
you mean very successful.
Very, 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 very successful. But I remember saying to a bunch of the people at the gym, who were saying to me, bloody hell, Australian English is so hard to understand. The accents, the slangs, the expressions you guys use, the, cultural references all the time. You guys are just like really hard to understand. And I said, well, go find a podcast. There must be a podcast for, Australian English or something out there. Lo and behold, there was nothing. Wow. So I said, well, I did podcasting for quite a while and had a background in using Audacity and some of these other things, had a microphone from my Muso days, and then just took it upon myself to start creating episodes to help people.
And
nature does abhor an unexploited. It was a very excellent thing that I was trying to say there. Nature abhors an unexploited niche, doesn't it? Yes, chortle.
Exactly.
What is Aussie English? Can you sort of take us through what do you do on the show? How do you approach it, etc.?
Originally, it was, I'll teach everyone Australian expressions and Australian slang. And then I looked that up and was like, well, there's a lot of it, but also that's not much, in terms, that's a very narrow niche. And Australian English, is very broad. It's much broader than just our, whatever, as dry as a nun's nasty and, servo and all that sort of stuff that, we use,
take
but we
for
don't.
Granted, yeah?
Yeah. So I just decided I initially started with that sort of stuff, using the stereotypes, and then pretty quickly was like, you know what, I should just teach English and make English content with an Australian lens. And so then it became about just Australian English. And then after that, I was like, you know what, I really want to share more of Australian culture and history and news and current affairs and really help people who are coming here to make it, to integrate, to set their lives up in Australia. I want to give them not just content to learn English, but content that's going to help them learn English whilst also improving their knowledge of, the Australian government, our history, our culture, everything like that. So it's turned into pretty much I just talk about Australia, different topics, and sometimes I'll talk about expressions, but it's really just creating content about Australia and then making it English learning content for people to use if they desire.
And you have your father as a regular figure on your podcast. Tell us how that came about.
Oh man, I think he's very similar to Jake. He's a know-it-all, right? So, and he has an opinion on everything. So I said to Dad, I need to talk about the news, and you're someone in my family who's obviously Australian and has an opinion on everything. Did you want to come on so that people can hear another Australian speaking? They can hear an actual discussion where it's spontaneous. We interrupt one another. We just like this conversation. It's not planned. We're not reading off a script, and we can talk about the news.
Hey.
So pretty much
we are very. This is word for word exactly what I've got written down. Thank you very much.
That's it. But it just started out with getting him to come on, and it's just, funnily enough, because he has an opinion on everything, it pretty much becomes me introducing a news story and then asking him what he thinks. So it's pretty much me interviewing my dad every week.
And so
that's fantastic.
It is. It's very, very lovely. I think it's really good that you have that sort of connection. And I suppose, that's the thing with podcasters or YouTubers, isn't it? That you sort of eventually it becomes part of your life, right? It becomes like people start to want to get to know you and who you are, and so all of a sudden your connection to your family becomes interesting. You've also got a son who's part of your podcast as well.
Yeah, well, it's a fine line
he
there.
Was naughty yesterday. I saw you holding. Yeah,
I know. Well,
the thumbnail was you with him, and it's got the word naughty, and I was like, man, naughty's not too Australian, is it? I don't know, but
well, it's English, right? Now, someone was asking me, and one of my students, they were asking, can you use naughty in a cute kind of way, or is it really nasty to say that? Is it really horrible? And I was like, oh, yeah, you could probably use it. He's a naughty boy. It could be a joke, or he's a horrible naughty boy. Or you could use it, in the bedroom. He is a naughty boy. So there's a lot of different uses. But yeah, doing the podcast was very awkward in the beginning in terms of you have no idea about what people are like in front of a camera. And so I would be recording things on my phone to share. I would include certain family members who I would later find out are very uncomfortable with being on camera. And so it was a very interesting thing to have to kind of.
You're talking about privacy issues?
Not privacy. They just don't feel comfortable. And so even if they're in the background, I remember I did I did a little Instagram, news feed thing, one of those things that goes on and then disappears a day later with my niece. And that became a huge thing where my sister was not happy about that. So
and now you're no longer in the will.
Yeah. Well, she's the younger sister, so it doesn't matter anyway. But yeah, I don't know. You forget, right? Because you're fine with it all the time. The same with using Noah. I use him. I have him in videos. I try and include him. Because I want it to be a part of his life, but I try not to think of it. People will look at it and see, you could be just exploiting your son or whatever. And so there's those, you kind of have to try and balance those two things. But I think if you're doing it from a good place, then you don't really have to overthink it too much. But yeah, it is.
Sure, but he's also, part of a bilingual family as well, though, isn't he? So I'm certainly he's going to be benefiting from the things that you engage and involve him in, right?
That's it. Well, that's it. He's a freak on the phone already, and he's only 11 months old.
A freak on the phone.
Yeah, get to the camera, start taking photos. But it is interesting, and I think you don't appreciate until you start doing something like podcasting how much what you're saying, the content you're creating, is being used or is being heard, listened to, consumed by other people out there that you don't necessarily have an appreciation for. And so I've had probably hundreds of people tell me now, I've listened to every single episode.
Wow. And
I'm just like, there's 720 episodes on the podcast.
Yes, I've listened to every single one.
Yes.
Yeah. And you forget or you don't know how much people, after listening to a fairly substantial amount of you talking, they begin to understand you or like see you as a friend, or it is a very interesting,
overly familiar type of relationship.
Yeah.
Well, it was just funny. Like one example, we moved to Canberra because my wife started working for the Brazilian embassy there, and we were walking around the streets doing some photography, my wife and I, and all of a sudden this guy was pointing at us, and I was like, oh no, I've freaked some guy out taking a photo, and he was in it, and he's going to be like, what the F was this? So I delete that photo. And he walks over and he's like, man, I just got here from Brazil yesterday, and the first person I see in Canberra is you. And I've been listening to podcasts.
That is so cool.
That is the most lovely thing in the world.
Yeah, but it's creepy too at the same time.
Sure.
It's amazing. Sure. But it was
There were always, Pete, there were always, and Greg, I think we all probably experienced it, back in sort of the, whatever, early days of podcasting, back when we were doing Imaginary Friends and we were doing, the live shows down in Melbourne and as part of the book launch and all of those sorts of things. And people were a little bit overly familiar. They did, some of them did feel that they knew you perhaps better than other people, and thus had the right to invade your space, and
it's so hard. I listen to Joe Rogan every second or third day because he has such interesting people on there that he's interviewing, and I probably listened by this time to hundreds of hours of Joe Rogan talking, his opinions, his views, sharing his past, his thoughts, his history. And so I would imagine if I met him, he would never have, heard anything of me unless he was working on his Aussie accent. And yet I would be like, here's someone I've probably spoken to more than I've spoken to, my friends in the last few years.
That's really interesting.
Or heard from.
And the beautiful thing about podcasts is that they're free too. And like there's no real sort of, unless people sort of voluntarily pay, there's not a real sort of, if you've got a phone, you've got a podcast player, and if you've got a podcast player, you've got access to so much stuff, and the quality seems to be pretty interesting too. But I want to come back to I suppose the idea that you started to get noticed and you started to get some appreciation for what you were doing, which means that you were probably having a very positive impact on a lot of this, on a lot of these people. What is that positive impact? And I suppose what were people missing out on before you came along? Like, and how were they getting that information?
I think it's a good question. I think sort of finishing the last question, I do kind of see my responsibility now to show people my life, because I kind of feel the responsibility to show people what it is like to live in Australia, give people my thoughts and opinions on things. Whether or not they agree with me isn't the point, but just so they have an idea so that they can better learn about Australia, because I appreciated that from Français Authentique, that podcast, the French podcast I was listening to. He would always tell his opinions on things, what was happening with his family, what he was struggling with, what was happening in France. And that was why he was so successful, because people got sucked into that. They felt like they were listening to a friend, someone who was open and honest. And I think that's why people resonate with Joe Rogan so much, is because he does just open up about his life, his opinions and everything, as opposed to just have a list of questions with his interviewers and not share any of him personally and just ask the questions.
Yeah. Well, it's called the Joe Rogan experience, isn't it? Like,
exactly.
Let's sit down and have a human experience together. Yeah.
I think people resonate with that and they find that very authentic. And so I think that was something that was potentially missing in terms of English learning content at the time, to your latter question there, where a lot of the time there's loads of podcasts for learning English, but they tend to be off a script. There's no personality there. It's just a voice, reading off the script, teaching.
The boy went to the park.
Yeah, exactly. And so people,
very good, Jake.
They can use it.
I do this professionally.
They can use that sort of content to learn, but they can't necessarily resonate with it and dive further into understanding, the
context, would you say?
Yeah, well, just what it's like to be an Australian as well, okay. Right? So how I view the world.
Yes.
So
and what you're allowed to say, right? Because some people
this is where
live
it's
in countries
hard
where they're not allowed to say certain things and they get in trouble for that.
Exactly. And so I want to show people, I want to give people a behind the scenes look at what an Australian thinks like, behaves like, at least in my context of where I grew up in Australia. Obviously, I don't represent everyone, but that's...
So are you the reason why there's so many Brazilians visiting now?
100%.
I have a very big problem with Brazilians. I
think Bolsonaro is the reason that a lot of Brazilians are visiting.
That could be it. I just want to complete my thing so that people don't think that I'm racist against Brazilians. Not that that's necessarily a thing, but they're just so good looking. Mm-hmm. It's like as a people, they're. I mean, I'm shredded, right? and they're all shredded naturally. And they're all beautiful people. It's just, and their language. I mean, Portuguese is such a, there's no way I will ever speak Portuguese. It's too complex of a language for me anyway. I know you're looking at me like, Jake, we had this discussion last week and it's like one of the easiest things. But I've, my brother who married a Brazilian, they just, I can't understand it. There's no way I'll ever speak it. And I speak Italian. It's just so much of a different language. But yeah,
well, I think you have to have the motivations in place too. If you're not married to a Brazilian, you're not interested in soccer, you're not interested in going there.
I love soccer.
It's a little harder.
I love the soccer, but yeah. No, it is. So you are responsible for the influx of Brazilians, is what you're saying.
No, I think I just capitalized on it by meeting a Brazilian, marrying a Brazilian, having a half Brazilian baby, speaking Portuguese at home, and often showing that on Instagram. So I think half my followers probably are Brazilian.
So you spoke earlier about when you went to the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and you said that you felt shame, like as an Australian. Was that purely because of the language that we only know sort of one language, or like it's tokenistic in primary schools, or was there other sort of was there more to it than that?
I think it's mostly that, in terms of you just see these people who are so experienced culturally. They've come from foreign countries. They're, in high-paying jobs. They're well-educated. They speak multiple languages. They work their asses off in order to get to where they are. And I felt, obviously I'm not in the same position as them because I'm living in my home country where it's not really very useful for me to necessarily speak a foreign language if I'm, friends with 90% Australian people. But when I was suddenly surrounded by all these people from other countries who spoke multiple languages, and you would interact with them on a daily basis, in Melbourne these days, you get on a tram and you're more likely to hear Chinese or Mandarin Chinese, Indonesian, Portuguese than you are English.
Yeah.
Because there's just so many young students that have come over. I think, the average age in Melbourne's probably 21 or something crazy.
Yeah, right.
But I felt that sort of shame and embarrassment of I'd never put in the hard yards to get to where they've gotten, And so, and it seems like it's something that it seems to characterize most of Australia, the US, New Zealand, Britain, any of these countries that are native English speakers. It's a two-edged blade, right? The biggest problem is that the most useful language in the world is English. So if you already speak it, there's no real reason to learn another language in terms of it'll get me a better job, it'll lead to better prospects, unless you've gone down a very specific route in terms of, I don't know, trade with Brazil or politics in China or something like that, where obviously it'll give you an edge. Even then, though, the people you're going to interact with probably speak English way better than you're going to ever speak their language because they've been learning it since they were 5, so. And
we're motivated to do that. So that, in many ways it's to get out of certain classes in order to elevate themselves. Exactly. It makes a lot of sense.
Exactly. And that's one of the things too. I found that it's so hard learning a foreign language as an English native speaker because it is so much more on you to kind of discipline and motivate yourself.
Yeah. What's your motivation?
For me, it's my wife, right?
Yeah.
So without her, there's probably zero chance that I would speak Portuguese as well as I do today because I would have no need to. I would have to go out of my way to find Brazilians. So it's a lot more work. Whereas if I was a Brazilian living in Brazil, English is a way out of poverty or a way of elevating myself, of getting a better career, of learning more about the world. If I'm a Brazilian Portuguese speaker and I want to learn about Japanese history, chances are I can't find that in Portuguese. And this is one of those things I face all the time, looking for content in Portuguese. It's like you're going down a funnel into a much smaller pool of content if you're leaving the English-speaking world and going into any other language, because there's almost certainly less content than there is in English.
Yeah.
And that also is very difficult.
Especially with, like, I suppose the internet and that sort of thing too, like trying to find those resources. I mean, everything that sort of even older documents and all that sort of stuff uploaded and from those English-speaking countries.
Go to Wikipedia and change any of the pages into foreign languages. So if you went to History of Australia, change it into any of the languages down the side, the article's going to halve or probably, become a third of the length that it was in English.
So it's interesting that that I suppose you come at it, you sort of started this from an angle of that, I wouldn't say embarrassment. I like your word shame, I suppose. But obviously there's something about Australia that is attractive to these people who are coming. I mean, they're listening to your podcast before they get here. They're listening to your podcast when they're here. You're prepping them for coming over here. What is it about? I mean, maybe it's obvious, I don't know, but what is it about Australia that you see generally or specifically to other countries that's attracting them to be here, to come here?
It depends on the country. I think if we were to start with Brazil, Australia's...
Yeah, let's do alphabetically.
Azerbaijan, please.
That's it. Well, those guys, I've got a few students, Hey Akan, he's from Azerbaijan. So...
Hey Akan.
I would say, though, Brazil, for instance, they want to come here because of the climate. It's an English-speaking country. They've got, I think their first choice tends to be America. Then they've got, places like Canada and Britain and New Zealand. But ideally, I think Brazilians hate the cold weather. And so even the ones in Melbourne whinge constantly in winter. I would have my second dan black belt, one of the toughest guys I know, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu instructors, have the biggest teary when it was, 10 degrees outside. And so I think that's part of
You did know there's other places to live, yeah? Like it's quite a vast continent.
That's it, yeah. But that was a big thing, I think, climate and then culture. I think they do have an understanding that the Australian culture is very different from, say, American, because you are kind of, America's the land of opportunity and there's a lot of freedom there, but there's also a lot of guns. There's a lot of crime comparatively to somewhere like Australia, and you don't have the same kind of social security that you would have if you come to Australia once you become a permanent resident, with getting things like Medicare, having the minimum wage here, everything like that. So there's that. There's other countries you'll have, especially in Southeast Asia, where it's more about proximity and I think price. So it's a lot cheaper for someone from China to come to Australia and get educated at an incredibly good university, like, Monash University, Melbourne University, whatever. And it's right next door, so they can pay to have that done a lot easier than, say, try and go to America or Canada or Britain. So there's that aspect as well. And I think, too, with places like China, there's probably the trade. If you get your degree in business in Australia or you learn Australian English, you're probably most likely to, if you're working in trade and business, have a relationship with Australia than, say, America or Great Britain, because, we're next door. So there tends to be a lot of those sorts of reasons. Other ones will be political. Places like Iran. I have a load of Iranians always messaging me, telling me about coming out.
Is that the appropriate collective noun
for
Iranians? A load
flock?
of Iranians?
Flock? Flock of them. I don't know what you would use it. But yeah, they are trying to get away from, I think, their regime, if I am not putting myself in too much trouble by mentioning that. And I think China tends to be similar. There'll be a smaller percentage of the Chinese students I'll meet will be like, I just wanted to live in a freer country. And the other ones will be, I just wanted an Australian education and then I'm going home. And I don't care about governments or politics. I like China. I just want the education. I'm out.
That's probably very politically savvy, maybe, of those Chinese students, because there is, of course, they are heavily watched while they are here, particularly on campus at at various universities. I wonder whether I can ask you a bit of a political question, and specifically about your wife. Is she got citizenship?
She's about to get permanent residency, assuming the interview goes well when they finally ring us up.
Okay, well, I won't jeopardize that then. I did have a question about because quite often at citizenship ceremonies, it's conducted by a former politician. Yeah. In the case of my brother's wife, it was former International Affairs Minister Philip Ruddock, who was a really interesting dude in northwestern Sydney. But no, all right, I'll save that for when she does. I'll save that question for when she does get citizenship. But good luck. Hope the interview goes well.
It's a part two. Even I'm hanging on. Look at that. I'm excited.
But we could talk about that as well, I guess. We've had to drop $7,500 to apply.
Yeah.
And it's we had to pay a lawyer about $3,000 to do the application so that we didn't screw anything up. And then they just say, we'll call you in the next 2 years at some point to do a checkup. And then you if you pass, you'll get it.
I mean, this is how the government keeps everyone employed, Firstly, the first role of public service is to justify the public service. So you got to pay for it. Yeah. And then, you got to keep our most important citizens in work as well, of course, being lawyers. So it's really important to ensure that they get a slice of the pie. Who else? You've got the immigration officials. There's normally a whole bunch of applications and regular upkeep on those sorts of things. You got to keep. You got to translate documents, so you got to pay for translators.
That's crazy. Yeah, that was expensive.
It's a whole process. It's a whole thing.
Yeah,
It is.
There are whole industries around this.
Oh, absolutely. The lawyer that we paid, she only does applications for visas.
that's crazy. That's crazy. So, how long has the process been? How long has it been?
I think it's been 6 months since we've submitted it.
Yeah,
but
right.
you have to gather evidence for a good year. You have to have been together for a year. You have to gather evidence. So every time we went anywhere with family, we had to try and get photos with other family members to show that Kel had integrated into Australia and into my family. So you couldn't just have, people saying, yeah, they're a good couple. You would have to show over months and months and months that she went to this party with these people. She went to this party with these people. We had to get written, people write essays saying that we're a good couple and it's long term who weren't related to us. There's loads of stuff. And I understand why it's there, because there are, loads of old men going to Thailand and, trying to bring someone back and get paid 50 grand to marry them, give them citizenship and then go back. And that's the best
What is that?
scenario.
What is that plan? Can you just run that by me again? Just write it in my.
Well, I imagine that's why they set it up that way, to be strict and to avoid, I think, the issue of abuse, right, between couples, because you could hypothetically be a horrible human being, generally a male, who holds citizenship over your partner and threatens them and uses it against them,
right,
in order to get them to do certain things. And so I think they had issues with that, and that was why as well they tightened up the restrictions.
And that's part of bureaucracy, isn't it? I mean, we live in a quite a full on bureaucracy here in Australia, and part of bureaucracy is kind of, it's almost like the end of not to spoil it, but the end of 1984, right, where they sort of he loves Big Brother. You've got to find that bit that sort of makes you go, I understand why it has to be this particular way. And up until that point, it's very frustrating, isn't it? Like, up until the point where you actually figure out the why, things just seem like they're in the way just to annoy you or just to justify something. And I'm sure there are things like that, but navigating that is a mission as well. How have the current events then, I suppose, I'm talking about coronavirus here, with these different perspectives, Australia's really come out on top. I mean, to be frank, we're pretty good, right? And I know that I've deliberately
don't mention Taiwan.
No, I've deliberately come out of my. Well, I mean, we've come out on our own top. Like we've done well as a nation ourselves. I've tried deliberately to watch a few videos this week around people still criticizing the government's reaction to things. So I do have an argument against what we've done, and I do have some points of views around that. But I suppose my question is, how have you got a viewpoint from your listenerships about how people have viewed what's happening here in Australia, considering the news has become quite country centric as well. People tend to be getting their news from their own countries at the moment.
I think they tend to be pretty impressed with Australia. I've had quite a few people in lessons recently. I've got a Brazilian student, and she was talking about a virologist in Brazil who was doing a video and mentioned Australia compared to Brazil. And she was really shocked. She was like, I wasn't expecting them to tout Australia as, one of the best countries in the world. She was expecting them to just ignore us, and right. So she was really impressed, and she's really proud to be here. She's like, thank God that I moved my family from Brazil to Australia, considering how things are going in Brazil, where they have an authoritarian leader at the moment who says that the coronavirus is nothing worse than a cold and hasn't made any real changes to their social set up, and so they've got thousands of people dying now. But it is interesting to see the difference between Australia and America, because it's almost like their attitude towards freedom is a thorn in the side for them, I think, at the moment, because you've got all these people protesting against them having to have lockdown. And I think Australia, whilst we are very, very passionate about our liberties, we also know when we have to kind of suck it up and do what's good for everyone else.
We also like our parents and grandparents.
There's that too.
We acknowledge their existence and their potential frailty.
Yeah.
Well, how do you guys feel about our performance in comparison?
This is not your interview, Pete. This is not your interview. We're the ones asking the questions.
We ask the questions here.
All right, sorry.
If people want to know that, they can go to thepatchthepodcast.com, where they can choose their favorite you've
already covered that topic, huh?
No, you're allowed to ask a question, Pete. Go ahead. You're on the air.
Well, how do you think we've done compared to places like New Zealand, Britain, America, Canada?
You go, Jake. I'm obsessed. I'm obsessed with our country's obsession with Jacinda Ardern. To have this taste of sort of an American Canadian situation where people on Facebook or people on Twitter or whatever will be like, I can't wait to fly over there and become a New Zealand citizen. Gosh, I wish I could become a New Zealand citizen. And you're just like, you can, mate. Like, you can.
We don't need to.
You know?
Don't need to.
But you don't really want to, do you? You don't really want to. It's just that she's a little bit left of, center, and it's all very fun. And I think
she's never done blackface, so it's a little different from.
The Conservatives here don't really have that over her.
It is an interesting one, and particularly New Zealand, because they are so similar to us in many ways.
Yeah.
And I think, broadly speaking, their response was pretty similar to ours as well. I mean, obviously,
no, they had that full on lockdown, like because I've got family over there, so I've been texting them because they've been full blown like, don't you even think about going outside. You draw outside, those blinds.
Will shoot you.
Outside doesn't exactly. So
we'll use all the guns that we've recently confiscated.
I mean, I know what you mean. Like, it has been similar, but they did go full lockdown, and I think they've gone at least a day or several days without new cases at the moment. So, but so is South Australia.
I think it is just really interesting, though. It's such a stark difference between the US and Australia, even at a state level, where we're looking at what have we got, places like Virginia and that wanting to open up to business like it's normal again without the curve.
Michigan and Texas, they're all people who have said, I've just received a call from one Senor Trump or his son-in-law, and they've asked us to open the doors, and we said, yes, sir. Mr. Trump, sir, we will do. It's so interesting, and I realize this is not an American podcast, and I need to temper my thoughts rather quickly, but it was so interesting to see the overwhelming response from America, shut down, and now they're itching. Now they're freaking out of, we must open it up, and you had instances of Trump essentially inciting these. Look, I'm going to refer to them as violent protests because may not be violent in action, but it is certainly violent in intent. If you walk out with a gun and storm into your Capitol building, it's pretty intense. But in terms of the original question, I think Australia has done a remarkable job. I think we will be paying for this for generations, and I mean that quite literally. There will be probably two but potentially 3 generations of children who will be born and interact with our Australian economy, who will be paying off the debt that we've accumulated over this time through their taxation and income and interactions with various other parts of the economy. But broadly speaking, we've averted a disaster. We have lost almost 100 people now. And most of those came through either a cruise ship or a plane. But, again, broadly speaking, we've overcome potentially the biggest major disaster that we could have, possibly seen immediately following one of the biggest potential disasters that we ever could have possibly seen, i.e. the bushfires, which was immediately preceded by one of the biggest disasters that we could have ever possibly seen, i.e. the drought, the sustained drought across multiple states. So, I mean, Australia is and always has been a remarkable country of, polarized thoughts and opinions that have been galvanized under the leadership of, I got to say, Morrison has done a tremendous job, I think, by and large. There have definitely been things I should have acted probably 12 months sooner in terms of stimulus and listened to the Reserve Bank of Australia. But that's certainly not suggesting that we could have come out any better or different had that stimulus. I mean, certainly we wouldn't have had the amount of money to draw down on had we provided stimulus beforehand.
I would love to be a fly on the wall for ScoMo's, dinner table. I bet he's just like, oh, thank God coronavirus happened after the bushfires.
Yeah. I know.
I don't think so. I know what you mean. I don't like to think that. I don't like to think that he thinks that way. I really don't. But anyway, it's an interesting topic, and I don't know. I think that I always like to believe that the politicians we've got have good intentions, and that they're not, that yes, they're politicians, but that there is a bit of love in there, and that I've always admired that about a lot of our politicians, that are willing to actually speak love and all that sort of stuff. So it's quite good. But
the other side of that is, of course, Winston Churchill's quote: "Never waste a good crisis."
someone's got to see you through the crisis, right? Someone's got to see you through it. What about the English speaking countries, Pete? With your podcast, the Aussie English Podcast, do you have a lot of English speaking people who are getting something out of this too? I've got a little bit addicted to it, I've got to say. I'm like, oh, he's got another little video up. I'm gonna watch that.
You would be amazed. So I recently had someone buy an annual membership, my most expensive product, and their name was something like Bruce Turner. And I sent him an email and was just like, thank you so much for supporting the podcast and me putting food on my table for my family and everything. And I was like, are you from America? Because at the bottom it said, like Michigan or something on his email. And he's like, yeah, we just love coming to Australia once a year to go to Port Douglas. And I was like,
which is the equivalent of a Western Sydney person going to Aspen. So yeah, that's clearly that's pretty awesome, man.
It's pretty random. And I have people that are actors. A lot of actors are buying things like my pronunciation course because they're trying to do Australian pronunciation.
Or you're not allowed to talk about it.
No big names, but there are loads and loads of actors over there who are obviously having to apply for small parts that involve being an Aussie or something. I've had some people too who, most recently I got an email this week from a guy who was Australian, born here, moved to America, I think, in his teens, and then has just moved back at the age of 40. And my accent's a mess. I need to straighten it out and make it back to, make it great again, but Australia style. And so he's like, what do you recommend? And I was like, speech pathologist. Man, not qualified, but if anything, pronunciation course, go for it.
You'll have to get your son into speech pathology so that you can have the business. You'll have the whole business sorted out then.
Man, just corner the market.
Yeah.
Allied health. It's not a great paying job.
Yeah.
But it is interesting to see the different demographics of people. I was expecting there to be a load of young people listening to the podcast.
Can't actually speak English very well, apparently, and that's okay.
I'm still working on it, man.
We're all students, aren't we, Pete?
That's it, on the path of life. But there tends to be a lot of highly educated 25 to 45-year-olds who are, coming over from places like Iran, China, Brazil. Those tend to be some of the big ones that I never would have picked before doing the podcast. So it is interesting. And back to Iran, it's really interesting because I think the only people who can come here from Iran have to be skilled workers. And so every single one that I meet is an engineer, an architect, or, something else that's just crazy. They have a PhD or something. It's just nuts.
100 years ago, when I used to run call centers, and I'm probably talking about
Don't admit to that, Jake.
15 odd years. I used to run telemarketing call centers, and at evenings we'd run residential type campaigns. It was selling phone services, and
thanks for interrupting so many of my dinners.
Exactly, all of them awful because you would have been a student at that time. They're just gross, Maggi noodles, but it was always so interesting. You'd hire these people for $15 an hour jobs. And they were, quite often from the Middle East. They were nuclear. I hired a bunch of nuclear engineers. I remember a quantum physicist. They have these incredible educations, and they've come to Australia to work in a call center job, while they either, normalize their qualifications so they get a bridging type of thing so that they can work in Australia in their actual qualified field, or just so that they can work in Australia in a place that's not an oppressive regime.
It's crazy. And this is one of those sort of ethical situations. I would love to ask you guys what you think, but when you have a country like Australia or
we've
America
already been
or
on your
Britain,
podcast, Pete. This is
Yeah, you should have gotten your questions out of the way.
Yeah.
what do you think though of IQ mining, where countries like America, Britain, Australia, these big economies are effectively taking the brightest minds from developing countries around the world for good, right? Because it seems to be a very difficult position to be in, where you want to give anyone who's able to get here and will be good for our economy and our country, the ability to come here and stay here. But we don't often think that any nuclear physicist you're taking from somewhere like Ethiopia, Iran, Brazil is one less that they have there back in their own home country to help solve the problems they potentially have. How do you square that?
Well, surely they're coming here for opportunity that they, perhaps didn't have back there. But I suppose the thing is, Australia is a knowledge economy, and invariably you have to be a bit of a moral utilitarian in that we have vacuums, so to speak. We have vacuums in our country.
Well, medicine's a good example, right?
Yeah.
In the rural areas, you'll find, Indian and Iranian doctors living in the middle of the outback as full-time doctors, and you'll be like, "What? How did you get here?"
Yeah.
By plane. And they get absorbed into the community, and they become cornerstones. Often one of the most important individuals in a community is the doctor. They're the people that ensure that the productivity of that rural community is able to continue, and particularly as our rural populations age, because they are transitioning to vastly older populations than they were even just a generation ago.
So everyone's bailing.
Yeah, well, it's absolutely. I mean, there are more opportunities on the coast in our major cities, but invariably, without the fruit basket, without the bread bowl, without the meat, I don't know what goes with meat.
Well, I wonder how there's.
Sizzle?
I wonder if there's going to be some kind of a tsunami because of coronavirus causing people to work from home now, where we're just going to have a load of these jobs from now on just at home, and things will become more decentralized. You wonder if there's going to be a flood back into rural towns in the future where people say, screw living in a city of 4 million people. Like I'm like, Greg just went to the Blue Mountains, right? You were like, I need a bush change.
Yeah.
We haven't actually announced that on the podcast.
There was a little bit in between that thought and the actual process, but yeah, I mean, essentially, yeah, you can. Well, I mean, but we have transferable skills as well. Like we're both teachers.
Yeah.
My wife and I are both teachers, so we, it's a transferable skill, I suppose. The rural areas in Australia, I can see have less of an enticement over time, right? Because I mean, farming is not as enticing as it once was. Mining is. Not as enticing as, I don't know if it's ever been enticing, but mine is not as enticing as maybe it once was. I think that, that idea of fly in, fly out, and that the person doing that fly in, fly out isn't going to see their family as much anymore. What it does offer is community. What it does offer are those higher spirits, over time, I guess, a quieter commute to work, a quieter life overall. So those are the things you would have to want to work in those areas.
Yeah.
And maybe that we're going to see that big sort of rush out, or, like you say, you have the opportunity to go to a place, a rural area, and do your job because of technology and the way that it's been facilitated now as well. Yeah.
I mean, my big hope is that out of this we develop we reinvigorate some people's passion for manufacturing.
Yeah.
And I mean by passion, I mean sector-wide passion. A desire to, properly fund a manufacturing sector, which in Australia means it's going to be expensive. So Australians have to be willing to pay for it. We have to import some of the bits and pieces, or we manufacture those bits and pieces as well, components that go into whatever we end up manufacturing. But aside from that, we have higher wages than, say, our next nearest manufacturing place, which is, either Indonesia or China or somewhere in, one of the Asian belts. But I sincerely hope that out of this we recognize, at the very beginning of the coronavirus, shopping centres were essentially saying nationwide we have roughly 30 days of general stock. At any time, we have roughly 30 days worth of stock. Well, that doesn't work if you deplete all stock, unfortunately. So and when you think about things like cans of soup, we make all of the food in our country, and we make all of the cans. We put together the cans in our country. What we don't do is we don't mine tin so much anymore. We don't have the electrolysis methods that are required to form the tins into the tin shape. So as a consequence, while we make the food and while we package the stuff, we don't have the expertise or the manufacturing capacity to essentially do the whole process. So if we as a country can come together and think about some of these sectors that have been exported overseas that we perhaps would like to reinvigorate here, be smart about it. Solar cells. Solar cells would be a great one. We had expertise not so long ago in Australia with the process of making the most efficient cells, and now our intellectual property that was formulated here in Australia has been shipped over to China to make there, because essentially they can manufacture them cheaper and then import them back to Australia where we put them on our roofs.
Well, we're addicted to that though, right?
Absolutely,
we
love to pay less. And
yes.
I get that.
And it's so much easier to just buy something, use it for 2 years, throw it away, buy it again. And, obviously our capitalism favors that.
Rather reliant on it.
Exactly. So I don't know how you ever shift away from that now, unless you do use the government in order to make legislation to control.
I mean, America's been able to do that by just making junk. Like the stuff that's made in America is pretty bad. So, you can have that consumerist. I'm making a joke, but I realize I'm too sardonic. But the there's all those jokes about the crappy American. There's all those jokes about the crappy American-made cars that fall apart in 2 years in order to fuel, if you like.
Well, we've seen them here in Australia, right? They've taken off. Mustangs, the Yank tanks, they're everywhere now. The Commodores and the Falcons are all gone. The way of the dodo.
Yes, indeed.
Look, I think that it's part of it is driven by what people want, right? Like, I mean, we could get many more views on our podcast if we completely changed it and gave people what they want, right? I mean, look at something like TikTok or something like that. I mean, what people want is not what a general population want is not necessarily to, guys having a chat about politics every week, right? Like we have to deal with the fact that that's what we want to do, and that's But if we were in the business of, like, if we were Nova FM or something like that, and they wanted us to do the podcast, they're going to say, look, you're going to have to change pretty well everything about your show because it's not what people want. And so there's a certain sort of, people don't, I guess the question is, are people smart enough to know what they want? Are people, do we take it for granted that people are smart enough? And are we the silly ones for wanting better quality products where, maybe people are just like, well, it gives us a good relationship with countries overseas. Overseas, people get jobs. They get to dig themselves out of poverty. We get a relationship with them. We become a little bit reliant on them, sure. But, that's part of globalization, and I'd rather live in that society, and then I get things cheaper. Like, what's so bad about it,
Well, I guess we're seeing that now, right, with a lot of our economies being so heavily tied with China's economy. And,
but
China
it will go
tomorrow...
back that way. It's not like it's going to stop.
Yeah, but if China tomorrow decides they don't want any of our exports anymore, then we're in recession, right? I think it's something like 60 to 70% of our exports go to China, and so
yes, and most of them come from the ground. We're not selling them cool stuff that we made in our factories
because they make that themselves.
Yes,
I know.
For less.
I know we're sort of getting towards that hour mark, Pete. But what I'd love is that is a little bit of a, I suppose, a brief history of that, maybe just with the climax being that moment that you knew that your podcast was going to be self-sufficient for you, that you didn't have to worry about your PhD or, anything like that, that you actually are able to put money on the table, money on the table.
And eat it. Yeah.
That's how rich Pete Smissen is. Thank you to all that.
That's how strong my digestive system is.
Coins and all. I guess you've got the point. What that little journey about in that moment, you go, oh, hang on, I could probably make some money from this while still being a real positive influence on people's lives. Presuming you are.
I am. Take it for what it is. But I remember having a conversation with one of my students who was like, "Have you monetized yet?" And I was like, "What's that?" In terms of my podcast.
What is money?
Yeah, well, I was just releasing episodes, trying to help people. It wasn't really I want to, get rich, bro down. So I realized after having a chat with him that I could create content that sort of went with the podcast that was, a bonus material or whatever, and sell memberships to that. And I remember suffering somewhat, especially during my PhD, from imposter syndrome, which is a huge thing in the scientific world, especially if you're doing academia, where you just don't think you're good enough. You don't think you know enough, because there's so much ego posturing of other people who also suffer from imposter syndrome. But I felt that I'm not a qualified English teacher, I'm not a qualified podcaster, whatever that is. I've just started this in my bedroom and started doing it, which...
Oh, well, that makes you a qualified podcaster.
Yeah.
That's it.
The first 2 episodes we did, I was literally... The first 2 episodes that Jake and I did of The Pouch, I was literally underneath a blanket because we decided to go on holidays. My family and I went on holidays, and I was Googling on the way down how to record a podcast while you're away. They're like, that's fine. Just use your phone and go under a blanket. And I'm like, this is great.
I've done that. I've done that too. In fact, I had a box and I just stapled a blanket inside of it with the microphone.
In fact, well, that's it, isn't it? I mean, now you've just got like a bigger box, right? That you've just got a fancier box. I know there was at the end of some episodes, because we leave like a little, snippet of an outtake or something. There was some episodes at the end when we first started. It was just basically me taking the blanket off my head and just going, oh, I can breathe. I was sweating so much. I was like shirtless and just sweat dripping down everywhere and all this sort of stuff. And we're talking about the bushfires at the time. Anyway, but yeah, so you sort of, you started off and then you started to branch out. So you're talking about things like subscription models and stuff like that? Is that like you had another...
Well, it was definitely costing me money because I had to host things. I had to transcribe things to give people the written, transcripts of the podcast. And so it was starting to add up, and I thought, I've got to try and offset this at the very least. So I just asked the audience, you know, would you pay for transcripts? Is that a good idea? Would you appreciate that? Because then I can obviously pay more attention to making them better quality and do more for you. And they said yes. And I remember opening it up and, you know, I think I made something like $70 worth of sales in the first month. And I was chuffed because I was like, holy crap, people are buying from me. You know, something that I've made from scratch, people are paying money for. And then it just kept increasing month after month. And an important aspect of it was just maintaining that connection with the audience and asking, what do you want? What are you having trouble with? You know, it was sometimes I would notice that I hadn't kept in touch for months at a time, and I was just going off on a tangent that I thought was helpful. And then you'll ask them again, you'll do a survey, or, you know, just ask people to email you and have a conversation with them, and you'd find out, you know, actually they're trying to get help with this thing. They want a course on this. They want content that does this. And the more and more I listened to them and started trying to create the content without trying to be perfect and without pretending to be someone I'm not, you know, buy this one course and after 3 months you're going to be, you know, as good as anyone who's born in Australia. After just being honest and asking people what they want and then creating the products, it just sort of snowballed and has just kept growing ever since. So, yeah. And then I guess I finished my PhD when I was working in a restaurant, and I was doing that largely to pay for the rent because my scholarship for the PhD had run out. And I realized that my income from the podcast was getting to a few $1,000s a month. And I was like, holy crap, you know, this is going to pay for rent and food. And it seems to be increasing, you know, a few $100s a month every month. So maybe it'll eventually get to a wage. And I remember telling my supervisor at uni, because he was like, oh, what are you going to do after you finish your PhD? You need to apply for these jobs or these postdocs overseas in America and Europe.
No, I don't, man. No, I don't.
Man, I'm going to
do what I want, man. Off on a motorcycle.
Well, it's just like, I don't know if I really want to be a scientist because you guys are pretty cutthroat and it's pretty brutal.
Did you not? So you were having those thoughts beforehand. So this just sort of gave you that permission to be able to explore that thought a bit more rather than sort of go, well, I'm just stuck with this.
Yeah. So in the last year of my PhD, I met my wife, Kel, on YouTube. She sent me a message just saying, great job. I'm from Brazil. I thought it was really helpful. And I, you know, saw her on there and was like, I'm learning Portuguese. Which part of Brazil are you from? We struck up a conversation, and then I asked her to marry me, and boom. She's
great. It's a YouTube. It's a
but so I
romance.
I was finishing the PhD. I'd met her and I was like, I sort of want to give this a go. I don't really want to, a 9-to-5 job. And it was funny. I asked my dad, I'm like, what do you reckon? Should I give the podcast a go? Or do you think I should just try and get a real job?
He's like, what's a podcast?
No, he pretty much said, if you haven't worked it out yet, you're not going to be doing 9 to 5.
Is it making money? Yes. Okay. Well, you're doing better than the PhD already. So off we go.
Well, I told my supervisor, I said, you know what? I think I'm going to just give the podcast a go because I reckon I'll be making more than you in about a year. And and lo and behold.
Speaking of being smug.
You could have you passed up the opportunity, Pete, to be on the JobKeeper right now.
No, actually, I can. I'm applying for that currently. So
there you go.
Look,
that was effectively the nutshell. I had to just let go, give it a go, and the world didn't collapse. I'm not rich yet, but I can pay for things. Stay at home with my kid all day, every day with my wife, and it's just one income, but we're managing, and it's good fun. So.
And what about the impact of coronavirus on your listenership or on your podcast? I suppose this is a great test, right? Like this is if you can survive COVID-19 in 2020, you're onto a good thing, yeah.
Well, I was thinking at the start, I'm like, this won't touch me. Everyone's going to be studying at home now. But I think in the last month, it's definitely revenue has decreased quite a bit. So I think people are feeling the pinch now a lot more. And I've had quite a few, cancellations just saying like, I'm really sorry, I want to keep going, but I can't because I just don't have enough money. And I think it's sad that the students that are sort of marooned, stuck in Australia at the moment, especially the overseas ones who are working so hard and are a big backbone of the country, are in such a difficult position. I think thankfully, I don't know if it's countrywide, but in Victoria they can get money now. Some of the students to be able to pay for rent and everything. But yeah, I think we're gonna do all right. I think we'll pull through, but we have been affected just like all the other industries. But it does help. Because life hasn't changed much. I am just living the same life that I was pre-coronavirus. Inside every day, creating content, going out for one coffee and a walk. And so, not seeing anyone. So,
well, Pete, do you want to give the listeners a bit of a breakdown of how they can find you, and if they were so inclined after hearing you talk for a little while today?
That's a bit presumptuous, Jake.
Well, I'm inclined. I'm ready. I've got my pen.
If any of you guys are interested in Australian history and culture and interviews and you're native speakers of English, you can find Aussie English. Just search it on Google or, type in aussieenglish.com.au. If you know anyone who is learning English, Australian English, or if you are yourself, definitely go and check it out. And tune into the podcast, the Aussie English Podcast, if you want to learn more about Australian English history, culture, news and current affairs. Number one podcast for that.
Oh, you got that down pat.
I've said that quite a few times.
Yeah. We're still in the advertising phase, so I'm still like that. So podcast.com.
Well, that's what you guys need to work out a way. I don't need ads because I can promote my own stuff on the podcast. So that's the best part. I just start the episode and it's like blah, 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 blah. Make sure that you check out my products. Blah, let's get going.
Well, we just invented news and politics not so seriously. We just sort of
we do have the Scott Morrison poster.
Yes.
The Scott Morrison earrings
and the Jacinda Ardern tea towels.
Yes.
Where can we get those?
At thepouchthepodcast.com.
The podcast. Yes.
Now, okay, all right. So check out the Aussie. Now, I want to be very specific about this. It's AUSSIE, just in case people end up going to like some weird Ozzy Osbourne podcast or something like that.
Exactly. It is.
That's a very different podcast.
Exactly. But you'll find it. Just type in Australian English podcast. You'll find it.
And Pete, final question.
Yeah.
Final question.
Am I wearing pants?
How do you say?
How long have you not been wearing pants?
How do you say isthmus?
Isthmus. I would say isthmus. Yeah.
Isthmus. Oh. ISTHMUS.
Yeah, isthmus. I don't think I would say isthmus. No.
Yeah.
What is that?
Too much.
An isthmus. Oh, you go, Pete.
I don't even know. Isn't that like related to an island?
Yeah, it's a small island.
Are you talking about Christmas?
No,
like Christmas island?
No. So an isthmus is a small island that is connected to a main body. So
Fraser Island.
Christmas Island. Yes, Fraser Island is a good example, whereas Christmas Island is off the coast.
Oh,
and
I thought you were just mispronouncing Christmas Island. Right.
No,
So-
isthmus. Isthmus.
So, Pete, are you Ridgy Didge or just a cobber looking to rip off your mates for a quick buck? There you go.
Both. I'm both. I'm Ridgy Didge. Fair income, Ridgy Didge.
Have you done all of those? Have you done Ridgy Didge?
I don't know if I have. I don't think I have.
Is it actually
It's
a thing?
so hard.
I might have made it up.
This is the difficult thing with going down that. There are definitely a lot of Australian expressions that people know, but I don't know if they use, right? So things like Ridgy Didge, it's kind of like every single person knows what that is, but I don't think I ever hear people using it
That's a good
naturally.
point.
They'll use it ironically and be like, yeah, this guy's Ridgy Didge.
Yeah.
You know, or it's dry as a dead dingo's donger out here.
Yeah.
And you're like, no one says that naturally. They say it because they're trying to make a joke, right? It'd be stupid.
I mean, fair shake of the sauce bottle, buddy.
Yeah, I think fair dinkum.
Just put your shoulder to the grind.
I think-
put your shoulder to the cart, wasn't it?
Yeah,
that was a
shoulder
recent
to the
one.
cart. Yeah, we had to have basically a whole episode explaining that one. What? I can see what you mean. That's really interesting. Like I would have thought, yep, that's your content. But what's the point in that? They're just going to look silly if they get off the plane and they're like, "Isn't this Ridgy Didge?" You know, like, everyone's going to be like, "No, you're trying too hard, mate."
Someone sent me an email and every second word was slang.
Yeah, right.
And I was just like, all right, you're going to have to lay off. You're going to have to lay like, hey,
Easy.
how's it going, cobber? I just wanted to have a yarn so that I could. I was like, just you can sort of, it's like one of them a paragraph. One slang word a paragraph's enough.
And that's interesting that you have to quantify that, right? That's the interesting thing to me is that you go, okay, what is the actual formula for using these things that we do? One of my favorite ones is Arj Barker. You'd know it for sure when he talks about the fact that we have these crazy slang words and that he reckons that he could just make it up. He knew the formula and he could just make it up. So he went around the shopping centre and the lady said, do you need a hand? And he goes, "Nah, thanks, mate. Just having a squidgery didge." And
And she was like, "Oh, spot
she was
on."
like, "Yeah, okay, no worries." And you're like, "That's so funny. I knew exactly what he meant." And yeah, so I don't know. I think we've wrapped up the podcast, but I'm still going. ADHD's kicked in. Ritland's worn off, and off we go. What about these? Like I know. What are these ones that you have in Ireland? What are they called? Like the rubbery dub and all that sort of stuff. Like, is that?
Cockney.
Yeah, Cockney.
Right?
Do
Cockney,
they actually
North-
use that?
Northern.
Is that,
Yeah.
or are other
Yeah.
countries in the similar boat to us?
The weird thing, I was watching something recently on YouTube that was about Cockney rhyming slang, and they still use it over there quite a lot. I think in Australia it's died off. My dad jokes about it sometimes, like a dog's eye and the dead horse and
Yeah.
everything. And I think, again, I'll use it, but I'm taking the piss.
Yeah, right.
Right. Not really serious about it. But we do actually use quite a bit. Like taking the mickey
Yeah.
is one of them. There's quite a few of them that are sort of subtle that you don't even realize are actually rhyming slang originally, but are still being used. But those dead horse, dog's eye, and all of that sort of stuff, it's kind of
Well,
it's definitely part.
even just in the last few conversations that we've had, because we were on your podcast, you're on our podcast, I'm so much more consciously aware of when we've used certain, like, I suppose, Australianisms or slang or whatever it is. It's interesting to sort of go, that'd be a good one to do, and how unnatural it is to use
Have
a word
more
like
conversations. Have more conversations with Americans and Canadians,
Yeah.
and just wait for them to that sort of twisting their head like you've shown a dog card trick kind of a thing. Like, what?
Yeah.
Because I'll say things like, "Oh man, I don't, I barrack for the Essendon. What are you talking about?" And they'll be like, "Barrack? The hell is
Right.
barrack?"
Yeah.
What's
I'm
an
like-
Essendon?
Yeah, I don't root them, and I don't root them. I don't have sex with them, and they'll be like, "What do you mean have sex?" And I'm like, "Oh my god,
Easy.
you're not even speaking my language."